I'm Ryan Leckford-Brown of Chelsea Financial Services. We're joined today by Mark Martin, manager of the Neptune UK Mid Cap Fund. Thanks for joining us, Mark. Now, the Neptune UK Mid Cap Fund invests primarily in FTSE 250 companies. Can you just explain to us what that is?
Yeah, so the FTSE 250 is the middle section in terms of size of the FTSE all share. So all the companies that are listed in the UK, the FTSE 250, FTSE Mid Cap Index, is those companies that sit in the middle in terms of size. Obviously, the constituents of that index can change from time to time, and during the course of the year there are regular periods when the constituents of that index are changed, but essentially it is those middle-sized companies within the UK.
Whenever there's negativity or uncertainty surrounding Brexit, the FTSE 250 is one that gets particularly hard the most. Do you think that's justified?
The FTSE 250 is more domestically orientated than the bigger companies within the UK market. So I do think to some extent that it does make sense that as uncertainty increases around Brexit, the FTSE 250 is hit somewhat harder. However, the most important thing for the market, which acts as a discounting mechanism, is whether that uncertainty is already factored into prices. And I would argue to a large extent that when we see people talking on the news, in the front page of the newspapers, about Brexit-related uncertainty, that actually a lot of that uncertainty has already been factored in. So going forward, I would actually expect returns for the FTSE 250 to be somewhat stronger, unless the narrative around Brexit deteriorates even further.
Now, speaking of uncertainty, the fund was launched at the height of the financial crisis. Over the last 10 years, we've seen some extraordinary market and economic events, including Brexit. What's been the one thing that stood out for you over the decades?
As you say, there have been a lot of geopolitical events, Eurozone crisis in 2011, general election. But I do think Brexit at the moment is probably the standout thing. Just because we obviously have general elections on a regular basis, typically every 4 years, whereas this Brexit event, if and when it happens, is a real one-off. So that for me is the big standout.
And how is the fund positioned at the moment? Whereabouts are you finding the opportunities?
Obviously we are focusing on where we see the most upside, and that for us at the moment is more in internationally focused companies. So I was saying earlier that a lot of negativity, I believe, is already reflected within the FTSE 250 and within valuations of the FTSE 250. But we are still seeing greater opportunities in internationally focused companies. And that is partly because we have seen, if you look at things like house builders, we have seen them being artificially stimulated by things like Help to Buy. We do believe at Neptune that interest rates will rise over the next 5 to 10 years, and as things like Help to Buy come out of the system, which they are expected to do in coming years, we think that may be somewhat of a headwind for some of the house building shares, for example, that perform very strongly. So for the time being, we're tending to avoid most of the domestic cyclical companies and preferring internationally focused companies.
So with all of that in mind, why would investors put money in mid-cap over large-cap?
First of all, the UK market in general, because of Brexit fears and because of political fears in general, is cheaply valued. So if you look at price-earnings ratios for the broad UK index, they are relatively low, particularly compared to places like the US. Within that, the mid-cap index, in which the fund is, as you say, predominantly invested, is even more cheaply valued. So you have, by investing in a mid-cap fund, you're investing in a fund that is exposed not only to a cheap broad market, but actually, even within that, a cheap subsection of that cheap market. And I do also believe, and we are seeing it even in recent days, that M&A will continue. And we saw just a couple of days ago BTG being approached, a healthcare company, being approached by a US buyer for a significant premium. And I think that dynamic will continue because the UK does continue to have some fantastic intellectual property and some fantastic technology contained within its companies.
Well, that's great, Mark. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
For more information on the fund, please visit chelseafs.co.uk.